Daniel Dillon, The Statistical Dead, written by Tane Blackadder. Read by Arthur Howard. The relentless downpour had at long last ceased its assault on the city. A profound, almost hesitant silence descended, broken only by the sporadic, rhythmic drip, drip, drip from the rusted awning outside, each drop a final, fading echo of the storm's passing fury. Through the water-streaked window of Mel's diner, the world outside was transformed into a blurred, impressionist painting of reflected neon and slick, dark asphalt. The cityscape glistened under a heavy, bruised sky, the deep purples and greys of pre-dawn slowly giving way to a soft, peach-colored luminescence on the horizon. Patches of pavement began to steam faintly, ghostly tendrils of vapor rising to meet the cool morning air, as if the very streets were sighing in relief, exhaling the pent-up tension of the long, tempestuous night. Inside, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the cleansing chill outside. It was close, warm, and carried the deeply ingrained familiar perfume of decades-old coffee grounds, sizzling bacon fat, and the faint sweet tang of maple syrup, a scent that spoke of weary comfort and greasy spoons. This air felt almost peaceful, but it was a peace that was painfully fragile, a tentative and delicate truce. It was the eerie, hollow quiet that settles in the immediate aftermath of a cataclysm. When the bomb has already detonated, the shattering roar has faded from the ears, but the dust still hangs thick and motionless in the air, each particle a silent witness to the violence that just occurred. We were suspended in that quiet, Daniel and I, two figures anchored in a vinyl booth, marinating in the grim residue of the Sanderson case. The visceral horror of it all refused to recede. It clung to us, a psychic residue as palpable as the diner's grime. The memory of the elaborate medical fraud, a cold and calculated betrayal of trust, the husband's monstrous, heartbreaking calculus, weighing one life against another in a twisted moral equation, and the sterile, chilling terror of that hidden incinerator room, with its clinical lights and the ominous hum of machinery designed for silence. It all sat between us on the Formica table. It was a cold, heavy stone of dread lodged deep in the pit of my stomach, a constant nauseating reminder of the darkness we had just stared into and the profound, intimate betrayal we had narrowly undone. Daniel was quiet. But this was a different quality of quiet altogether. It was not the vast, hollowed-out silence of his grief, that profound emptiness that had taken up residence in him 2 years ago and had become his defining feature, a cavernous space where joy and light had once lived. That old silence was still there, a deep foundational stratum of his being, a sorrow so ingrained it was now simply part of his geology, but layered over it now was something new, something different. A contemplative stillness had settled upon him, a palpable calm that was more than mere absence of speech. It was a deep, almost physical pensiveness that seemed to slow the very air around our booth. He had been this way, wrapped in this new and unfamiliar stillness, ever since we had left Sarah Sanderson in the safe, sterile care of the clinic. His hands would cradle his coffee mug, but he wasn't really seeing the dark, swirling liquid within. His gaze was turned profoundly inward, his eyes focused on some distant internal horizon, as if he were watching the replay of a memory he couldn't quite name, or listening to the faint echo of a forgotten melody. It was as if, in the act of wrenching Sarah back from that terrible abyss, from the clinical horror of that room and the ultimate betrayal of her own husband, he had been forced to confront something beyond the darkness that had been his constant companion. In her eyes, in her unbroken spirit, even amid such profound violation, he hadn't just seen a victim to be saved. He had glimpsed a reflection, a stark, powerful echo of his own rugged, tenacious will to survive. He had seen a resilience that did not shy away from pain, but had stared directly into it and refused to shatter. And in recognizing that fierce, familiar strength in another soul, A single small shard of the perpetual ice within him had not melted, perhaps, but had begun to shift, to recalibrate. It was the quiet of a man who, after a long winter, has just heard the first impossible trickle of water running beneath the frozen ground. The fragile, contemplative silence that had settled between us was annihilated in an instant. The phone's ring wasn't a mere sound. It was a violent, percussive event, a shard of raw noise that tore through the diner's hazy atmosphere with the sudden, shocking force of a gunshot. It was our phone, of course, the old beige relic squatting on the counter beside the sugar shaker, its coiled cord a tired, lazy spiral. That specific jarring jangle was always an unwelcome intrusion, a demand from a world of chaos that insisted on piercing our small island of relative calm. But on this particular morning, with our nerves still frayed and raw from the emotional wringer of the Sanderson case, the sound felt especially brutal. It wasn't just an interruption, it was a violation. A harsh and discordant note screeched across the delicate, quiet music of our recovery. A reflex took hold and my body tensed to rise, to cross the short distance and silence the screaming instrument. But I was stopped before I could even push myself from the vinyl seat. Daniel's hand moved, not with a grand gesture, but with a swift, economical flick of his fingers, a subtle yet absolute command to halt. My eyes snapped to his. His gaze held mine, and in those deep, weary pools was a silent, unmistakable order. Let it ring. He didn't look at the phone. He listened to it. He was performing an instant, intuitive calculation, assessing the precise weight and texture of the sound, divining the specific frequency of desperation it carried across the line. Each ring was a question, a plea, a potential tragedy waiting to unfold. He was measuring it, determining the sheer mass of the burden it represented, before willingly allowing it to enter our world and shackle itself to our lives. He would not commit to its gravity lightly. The first ring was a shock, the second an assessment, the third a judgment. On the fourth piercing ring his decision was made. He gave a single slow and deliberate nod, a somber permission to invite the unknown into our booth. The profound gravity of Daniel's silent assessment seemed to transfer directly onto me, a tangible weight descending upon my shoulders as my fingers finally closed around the receiver. The hard, unyielding plastic felt shockingly cool against my skin, an inert object that nonetheless thrummed with a connection to another world, another life being torn apart at the seams. It was a lifeline, yes, but one thrown from a ship already engulfed in flames. Grasping it meant willingly tying myself to a tragedy already in motion, to a reality undoubtedly saturated with a fresh, unique brand of anguish. I raised it slowly, the gesture feeling ritualistic, and brought the cold, smooth curve of the earpiece to my head, a portal about to open. I consciously willed my voice into a practiced, professional cadence, layering it with a forced, steady calm, a deliberate, almost jarring contrast to the phone's own violent, screaming interruption that had shattered the peace of our morning. Dillon Investigations, I stated, the two words spoken not as a greeting but as an invocation. They were a gateway, a threshold being crossed. The moment they left my lips, I knew they would unleash the next harrowing chapter of a stranger's unraveling nightmare into the sanctity of our booth, and there would be no closing the door once it had begun. A staticky silence hissed for a heartbeat, a void waiting to be filled. And then it came. The voice that seeped through the line was unmistakably a man's, yet it was stripped of all bass and bravado, rendered thin and reedy, a frayed wire vibrating under an impossible strain. It was a voice stretched so taut that it seemed on the verge of not just cracking but of snapping entirely, dissolving into a silent scream. This was not the sound of simple sadness or fear. This was the raw, desolate sound of pure, unadulterated shock. It was the vocal signature of a soul that has just been blindsided by a catastrophic, life-altering blow. The kind of seismic jolt that short-circuits the nervous system and leaves a person not weeping, but utterly, functionally numb, a hollowed-out vessel where a human being used to reside, all emotion temporarily vaporized by the sheer, incomprehensible force of the news. A fractured, hesitant silence stretched across the line, a void filled only by the faint, ghostly hiss of the connection and the ragged, almost imperceptible sound of a man trying to remember how to breathe. Then the words came, stammering forth, as if each one were a shard of glass being pulled from his throat. My brother," the voice managed, the two words costing him a tremendous effort. A sharp, shaky inhalation followed, a gasp for strength that wasn't there. "Flight 417. The words did not simply enter my ears. They landed in the center of the booth with the visceral driving force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my own lungs. A cold dread, immediate and profound, washed over me. Everyone knew about Flight 417. It wasn't just news. It had been a national trauma, the lead story on every channel, a nightmare unfolding in endless, horrifying loops for the past 48 hours. The reports were all the same: a catastrophic mid-air failure, a sudden and terrifying loss of contact. Witnesses on the ground described a silent, blossoming fireball against the evening sky, a brief and terrible sun that sputtered out, raining incandescent debris over a vast, wooded state park. The search and recovery efforts had been plastered across the screen, grim-faced officials speaking in hushed, solemn tones. The final, awful pronouncement: no survivors, a total loss. The story was a closed book, a completed circle of unimaginable tragedy, a collective wound we were all already beginning to mourn. The automatic response felt like ash in my mouth, a pathetic, meaningless platitude offered to a man whose world had been vaporized. "I'm so sorry for your loss," I said, the words hollow and utterly, devastatingly inadequate against the scale of such a horror. But then the voice on the other end shifted. "That's just it," he whispered, and in that hushed tone the numb shell of his shock finally cracked. What seeped through was not grief, not yet. It was a raw, bottomless, and terrifying confusion. The sound of a man whose understanding of reality itself had been violently upended. He wasn't on it. The sentence didn't compute. My mind, trained for logic and pattern, rejected it outright. I froze, my grip tightening on the receiver. The diner, Daniel, the smell of coffee, everything receded into a distant blur. "I'm sorry," I heard myself say, the question a reflex, a stall tactic as my brain scrambled to process the impossible. "Peter." He said the name like a prayer, an anchor in a swirling sea of madness. "My brother, Peter Claymore. He was on the passenger list, his checked luggage, and it was in the hold. They confirmed it was on the plane, but he never boarded. He never got on. The world didn't just tilt, it lurched violently on its axis, the solid ground of facts and certainties crumbling away beneath me. A plane crash is an absolute. It is a finite, terrible event with a known and tragic roster. It is a closed circle. This was something else entirely. This was an impossibility, a profound and chilling paradox that unraveled the very fabric of the established narrative. One man had somehow stepped out of the story, leaving his belongings to hurtle towards oblivion without him. The tragedy was no longer just a disaster. It was a riddle, and at its center was a missing man who was supposed to be dead. My mind, reeling from the vertigo of his claim, instinctively scrambled for the solid ground of standard procedure, for the bureaucratic rails that are supposed to guide such tragedies. "The airline," I began, my voice a forced anchor of calm in the rising storm of his panic. "The authorities. The investigation. They must have a record, A manifest, something that can clarify this. There has to be a digital footprint, a security camera, My words were a lifeline thrown toward the rational, the explainable. A desperate attempt to corral this insanity back into the realm of the possible. The line erupted. "They have nothing," he cried out, and the raw, unfiltered desperation that had been simmering beneath the surface of his shock finally surged through, a torrent of anguish and frustration that crackled across the connection. It was the voice of a man who had already walked that exact path, who had already battered himself against the immovable walls of official indifference and cold, hard data. "I've begged them. I've shown them everything." The gate agent, she doesn't remember him. His boarding pass, it was never scanned. It's a ghost transaction. The seat, 14B. It was empty when they closed the doors. The official record shows it was never occupied. His voice climbed, trembling with the sheer, terrifying absurdity of it all. It's like he was just deleted from the flight, erased, a glitch in the system. But his bag, his suitcase was loaded into the cargo hold. They found it in the wreckage, Michael. They identified it. His name was on the printed passenger list they released to the families. And he called me. He called me from the departure gate. He said he was about to board. He was there. My free hand was already moving, a frantic automatic response to the cascade of impossible details. I grabbed a napkin from the dispenser, the cheap paper rough under my fingers, and began scribbling with a pen that felt suddenly insubstantial. The words bled into the fibrous surface. Peter Claymore. Flight 417 didn't board. Bag did. Each notation was a stark contradiction, a line of code that should have caused the entire program of reality to crash. The numbers in my head, the orderly columns and clean ledgers where I find comfort and control, didn't just stutter, they recoiled in protest. This narrative wasn't just messy. It was anathema to logic itself. It wasn't a puzzle with missing pieces. It was a picture that defied the very laws of its own composition. This wasn't a missing person case. This was an impossibility, a violation of cause and effect. A man had been present, then absent, all while the evidence insisted he had both arrived at the destination and never left the origin. The solid world of facts I depended on had developed a fissure, and through it a chilling and inexplicable darkness was pouring in. A profound, heart-wrenching vulnerability seeped through the line, the man's composure dissolving completely. "Please," the voice pleaded, the word escaping as a soft, fractured whisper, a sound so saturated with despair it seemed to physically ache. It was the tone of a man whose sanity was being publicly questioned, whose deepest certainty was being dismissed as a symptom of sorrow. Everyone, my family, the officials, they all believe I've simply gone mad with grief. They look at me with such pity and tell me I'm just in denial, that my mind can't accept the finality of it. A shaky breath rattled against the receiver. But I know my brother. I know his habits, his character, his essence. I saw his name on that official list with my own eyes. And then, in the next breath, it was as if he had been wiped from existence. You find lost people, don't you? That's what you do." The question was imbued with a final, desperate, almost childlike hope, a last gamble on a single fraying thread. "Please, I'm not asking you to find his ghost. I'm begging you to find out what happened to my brother in that terminal, in those critical minutes before that plane ever left the gate. Unravel those moments for me." My eyes lifted from the phone, seeking the one fixed point in my suddenly unmoored reality. I looked across the booth at Daniel. He was already watching me, his intense gaze locked on my face, his head tilted just slightly in that familiar, predatory way of his. He was silently dissecting my expression, reading the clear turmoil and the dawning confusion etched there, processing the sheer improbability of the story he could only hear one side of. Without a word, without a single change in his stoic demeanor, He simply held out his hand, his palm open and waiting. The command was silent but absolute. The burden of this strange, impossible story was to be shared. Without hesitation, I passed the cold plastic receiver from my hand to his, transferring the weight of a brother's desperate hope and the chilling mystery of a man who had vanished from a doomed flight. The transfer of the receiver was seamless, the weight of the stranger's despair passing from my hand to his. Daniel brought it to his ear, his movements economical, devoid of any wasted motion. "This is Dylan," he stated, his voice not merely low but a deep, steady rumble that seemed to emanate from a place of unshakable calm, a bedrock of certainty beneath the chaotic surface of the plea. It was a voice designed to command attention, to instill a fragile sense of trust in the midst of panic. Then he fell utterly silent. For a full, uninterrupted minute, he simply listened, a statue in our worn vinyl booth. His gaze detached from the immediate surroundings, fixing on some distant, invisible point far beyond the grimy, rain-streaked window pane, as if he were staring directly into the intricate architecture of the story itself, visualizing the timelines, the locations, the chilling sequence of events. His face remained an impassive mask, a masterwork of controlled neutrality, but for a single telling detail, a slight, almost imperceptible tightening of the skin around his eyes, a subtle narrowing that betrayed the intense, laser-focused concentration happening behind them. He was not just hearing the words, he was dissecting the tone, measuring the pauses, weighing the emotional resonance of every strained syllable against the cold, hard facts being presented. Finally, with a tone that brooked no argument, he delivered his verdict. "We'll meet 1 hour. Mel's Griddle." The sentence was a statement of fact, not a suggestion. Without another word, without a farewell or a reassurance, he terminated the call, the soft click of the receiver settling back into its cradle, sounding like a period at the end of a shocking sentence. The silence he left in his wake was heavy, charged with the lingering echo of the unbelievable narrative. I found my voice needing to articulate the insanity, to frame it in concrete terms, to make it real. "Man says his brother," I began, my own words feeling inadequate, "vanished into thin air from an airport terminal sometime between the check-in counter and the boarding gate of a flight that then proceeded to crash into a mountainside." I was summarizing a paradox, a ghost story wrapped inside a tragedy. Daniel's reaction was instantaneous and devoid of any theatrical surprise. He didn't blink. He didn't scoff. He simply processed the information with a ruthless, analytical efficiency that bypassed emotion entirely. His mind, a razor-sharp instrument honed in the darkest corners of human experience, immediately categorized the possibilities. Either he's lying to us, he's genuinely lost his grip on reality from the grief, or he paused, his cold, clear eyes locking onto mine, or a highly competent individual or organization successfully engineered the disappearance of a man from one of the most heavily monitored, densely populated, and security-obsessed environments on the planet. Executing this feat mere moments before that very location became a permanent, fiery tomb for everyone else aboard. He laid out the 3 options like a dealer laying out cards, each one more unsettling than the last. With a definitive gesture, he pushed his untouched, now cold cup of coffee away from him across the Formica table, a silent declaration that the time for contemplation was over. The case had been accepted. "Let's go with option 3, he concluded, his voice flat and certain. "It's usually option 3. The words were not spoken with relish, but with a weary, professional resolve. We were once again stepping into the shadows, where the impossible was just another Tuesday. Precisely 60 minutes later, the bell above the diner's door chimed softly, and a man stepped hesitantly into the hazy, familiar atmosphere of Mel's. Henry Claymore slowly, almost reluctantly, lowered himself into the very same vinyl booth that had, just days prior, held the treacherous performance of Ben Sanderson. The contrast between the two men could not have been more profound. Where Ben's display of despair had been a carefully constructed facade, a mask of anguish designed to manipulate, Henry's suffering was a raw and openly bleeding wound. He seemed to radiate a palpable aura of shock and profound confusion, a man whose entire understanding of the world had been violently upended. He was a history teacher, a man whose very essence seemed woven from gentle patience and well-worn cardigans, a person accustomed to the quiet, predictable order of textbooks and past events. Now he found himself trapped in a present-day nightmare, a living paradox that defied all logic and historical precedent. His world hadn't just been shaken, it had been completely dismantled, brick by logical brick, by a single inexplicable and terrifying fact. With a hand that visibly trembled, he wordlessly shoved a thin, disorganized file across the smooth Formica tabletop towards us. The contents were a heartbreaking archive of futile effort, poorly photocopied boarding passes, a printed passenger list with his brother's name, highlighted in a frantic yellow marker, copies of increasingly desperate emails sent to the airline's unresponsive customer service department. Each document was a testament to his frantic struggle to be heard, to make the official world acknowledge the terrifying glitch in its own records. Peter was an actuary, Henry said, his voice thin and reedy, the words seeming to cost him a great effort. He clasped his hands together in a vain attempt to steady their trembling. A true numbers man through and through. His entire professional life was dedicated to calculating risk, to quantifying probability, to building models of cold, hard predictability for a living. He was the last person on Earth who would simply not board a flight he was scheduled to be on. It would have violated his every principle, and he most certainly would not just vanish into the air. It's an statistical impossibility to him was. The past tense caught in his throat. Daniel, his expression unreadable, began to slowly sift through the pathetic pile of papers, his keen eyes scanning each line, as if he could divine the truth hidden between the printed letters. Without looking up, he posed the essential, chilling question, his voice a low rumble. Any reason at all, any reason someone would want to make him disappear? Did he have any conflicts, any debts, any secrets? Henry shook his head, a gesture of utter helplessness. He crunched numbers for a mid-level insurance firm. He wasn't a spy. He didn't deal in state secrets. He didn't have powerful enemies. His entire life was spreadsheets and Sudoku puzzles and quiet evenings at home. He said it with a devastating simplicity, painting a portrait of a man of pure, mundane order, a man of numbers, my kind of man. An unexpected, powerful sense of kinship with this vanished actuary bloomed in my chest. I saw a kindred spirit, a man who found solace in the clear, unambiguous language of mathematics, now lost in a fog of the irrational and the inexplicable. I turned my gaze from the grieving brother to my partner. The money, I said to Daniel, the two words laden with certainty. My own mind, so similar to Peter Claymore's, was already racing down the logical path. If he discovered something he was never supposed to see, if he uncovered a flaw in the system, a fraud, it's always hidden in the numbers. It's the only thing that makes sense. The trail wouldn't be found in a dark alley. It would be buried in a ledger, a decimal point out of place, a pattern where there shouldn't be one. Daniel's focus shifted palpably, his eyes losing their connection to the immediate surroundings as he turned his vision inward, delving into the intricate, three-dimensional map of the city's secret pathways and institutional vulnerabilities he maintained within his mind. An airport isn't just a building, he stated, his voice becoming low and analytical, almost musing. It's a complex living machine. It operates on strict, predictable rhythms, on schedules and procedures. It has its own pulse. And like any complex system, it has its flaws, its predictable patterns, and, more importantly, its intentional blind spots, places designed to be unseen. His gaze, sharp and calculating, lifted from the table and settled on Henry Claymore, the full weight of its implication clear. A person who understands that machine intimately, who knows its schedules and its security theater, who knows which cameras are dummy units and which guards take their breaks at precisely 10:15. That person could make a suitcase full of contraband vanish between the curb and the baggage carousel. He let the concept hang in the air for a moment, letting its cold logic settle. Or, he said, the single word dropping into the silence with the weight of a stone, a person. The hunt from that moment was engaged, and it immediately split into two distinct, parallel fronts, each playing to our unique strengths. Daniel became a phantom in the daylight world of public transit and public fear. He went to the airport, not as a passenger but as a predator, a wolf moving with silent purpose through a vast, anxious herd of sheep. He utilized an old, nearly expired security pass procured during a forgotten case years prior. The faded photo and outdated logo just plausible enough to grant him an aura of unremarkable authority. He blended into the background noise of the terminal. His eyes, however, missed nothing. They catalogued the subtle hierarchies of the staff, the precise timing of the cleaning crews, the location of every maintenance closet and every service tunnel access point. He noted the unmarked reinforced doors that whispered with the hum of hidden machinery, the private arteries where the true lifeblood of travel, luggage, supplies, and sometimes people flowed unseen by the public. While he navigated that physical labyrinth, I plunged into the intangible digital ghost of Peter Claymore. My domain was the world of data, of footprints left in silicon instead of sand. His primary bank accounts were a study in mundane fiscal responsibility. His work email inbox was a desolate desert of dry technical correspondence, endless actuarial tables, dense policy assessments, and scheduling requests for meetings about risk mitigation. It was a portrait of a man dedicated to order. But then persistence unearthed the secret. Buried deep within a secondary encrypted cloud storage account, one not linked to his main email, protected by a password I correctly guessed was his personal best time for an expert-level Sudoku puzzle, was a single unmarked folder. Inside was not a game but a damning intellectual vault. It contained a series of breathtakingly complex interlocking financial models. These weren't standard risk assessments. They were forensic maps, cross-referencing massive sets of claims payout data from his own firm with the financial flows of a Russian nesting doll of shell corporations and holding companies. My blood ran cold as I traced the connections. One of the entities, buried under 7 layers of obfuscation, was a subsidiary of a company I knew in my bones, Etherius Corp. The tendrils of that monstrous octopus had reached out and touched yet another life, this time snuffing it out through a different but equally cold calculation, a glacial dread. Immediate and absolute seized me. It wasn't just a chill. It was a full-body paralysis of horror, a sensation of ice water flooding my veins. This wasn't a new corruption. It was the same monstrous, multi-headed financial hydra we had confronted before, the same creature whose venom had poisoned a hospital. Only this time, it had coiled itself around the very pillars of the insurance industry. The river of dirty money was the same, but its course had changed, now flowing through the calculated, respectable channels of actuarial science and risk assessment. Peter Claymore hadn't merely stumbled upon an isolated accounting error or a single fraudulent claim. He had performed a breathtaking feat of intellectual archaeology. He had reverse-engineered the entire monstrous scheme from the ground up. With the meticulous patience of a master watchmaker, he had built an elaborate, terrifying model. It didn't predict random accidents. It predicted a specific series of catastrophic high-payout events, These weren't tragedies. They were meticulously calculated investments. Peter hadn't just crunched numbers. He had quantified apocalypse. He had calculated the precise profit margin of a disaster, and there it was on the screen before me, a line item in a column of doom. Flight 417 was on his list. It wasn't a prediction. It was a line on a balance sheet. The horror was not that the plane had crashed. The horror was that for someone, its destruction was a foregone conclusion. A financial trigger that had been pulled. My hand was trembling as I fumbled for my phone, my fingers feeling numb and alien. I hit the speed dial for Daniel, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He answered on the first ring. He knew, I blurted out, my voice strained, tight with the effort of containing my revulsion. Daniel, he knew. He knew about the crash before the plane ever left the ground. It's all right here in his numbers. It's a blueprint. He was assembling the evidence. He was going to the authorities. They must have discovered his investigation. They found out. Daniel's voice came back, not surprised, but grim, solid, and terrifyingly certain, a rock in my churning sea of panic. I know how they did it. The sound of ambient airport noise, a distant boarding call, the hum of a crowd, faded slightly, as if he'd turned away from the flow of people. The airport has a private, ultra-exclusive concierge service for its most elite, high-value clients. A completely separate, unmarked side entrance. No TSA, no security scans, no queues. It offers direct tarmac access, private limousine transfers to waiting aircraft. It's a perk for celebrities, Fortune 500 CEOs, diplomats, and for people who need to be moved from point A to point B without a single official eye witnessing the transaction. The final piece of the horrific puzzle clicked into place with an almost audible snap. Etherius, I breathed, the name itself tasting like ash. They have an account. Of course they do. They used it. They used their membership like a skeleton key. They intercepted him, Daniel stated, his tone flat and forensic, laying out the crime scene. They knew his schedule, his anxiety. A man like him, nervous about his flight, rushing to confront a terrifying truth. A polite, official-looking person meets him at the gate, offers a quiet, fast, stress-free alternative to the crowded boarding process. A private car straight to the aircraft door. He's flustered, he's in a hurry, he's terrified. He takes it. They walked him right out a side door, a door that doesn't exist on any public map, and directly into a waiting van. His checked luggage, already processed, continued its journey onto the plane without him. They didn't just kidnap him. They made him vanish into thin air, right under the gaze of 100 cameras, because they owned the one blind spot that wasn't a mistake. It was a paid-for feature. A new, more immediate terror surged within me. Where is he now? I asked, the question hanging in the dead air between us, heavy with the dread of its possible answer. Daniel's response was low, cold, and devoid of any hope. If they went to this much elaborate, audacious trouble to disappear him before a very public tragedy, he reasoned with a brutal, chilling logic, it's because they still have a use for him. He's not just a liability, he's a resource. He's the actuary, the architect of the model. He understands its every variable, its every delicate equation. They'll squeeze him dry. They'll torture him for every last bite of data in his brain. They'll force him to refine his own prophecy of profit and death. And then, Daniel concluded, the finality in his tone absolute, when he is utterly spent and has outlived his usefulness, they will add his name to the official crash statistics. He will become a posthumous payout on his own policy. A perfect closed loop, the ultimate actuarial fantasy. The trail of corporate ownership, a digital breadcrumb trail I had painstakingly followed through labyrinthine registries and shadowy holding companies, led us to a long-term vehicle storage facility on the desolate, wind-swept fringes of the city. It was a bleak landscape of chain link and concrete, a place where things were forgotten. And there it was, parked between a rusting RV and a boat on blocks. The sleek black van from the concierge service. The facility itself was just another asset in Ethereus's vast impersonal portfolio. This location, however, was different from the others we had encountered. There was no massive, anomalous power draw, hinting at supercomputers or clandestine laboratories. No hidden infrastructure humming with sinister purpose. This was a place of quiet disposal, of patient waiting. It was just a simple corrugated steel storage unit, its roll-up door secured by a heavy-duty padlock, its perimeter watched over by a single lone guard who projected an aura of profound boredom more than menace. He looked less like a trained enforcer and more like a disinterested accountant, slumped in a folding chair scrolling through his phone, utterly oblivious to the significance of what he'd been paid to ignore. Daniel's approach was a masterpiece of economy and silence. The time for complex electronic countermeasures and dramatic physics-defying confrontations was over. This was a straightforward, brutal arithmetic of action and consequence, a simple extraction. He became a shadow, utilizing the natural cover of the other stored vehicles, his movements fluid and utterly soundless. He didn't need to defeat the guard. He only needed to bypass him. A well-timed distraction, a rock skittering against metal several rows over, was enough. The guard's head jerked up, his attention successfully pulled away from his post for the critical few seconds Daniel required. In that window, a set of lockpicks appeared in Daniel's hands, and with a few deft, almost artistic manipulations, the hardened padlock yielded with a soft, metallic click. The guard, hearing nothing amiss, returned to his phone. We slipped inside, the heavy door rolling up just enough to admit us before closing again, sealing us in a different world. The air inside was thick, stale, and heavy with the smell of dust, old motor oil, and the faint, sweet scent of dry rot. The space was a tomb of abandoned projects and forgotten lives, illuminated only by a single bare bulb that cast long, dancing shadows. The ghostly, sheet-draped shapes of furniture hulked in the darkness like sleeping beasts. And there, in a cleared space at the center of this neglect, under the bulb's stark, unforgiving light, was Peter Claymore. He was lashed to a simple wooden chair, his posture slumped, his face pale and etched with a deep exhaustion that went far beyond mere physical fatigue. His clothes were disheveled, his hair a mess, but he was undeniably blessedly alive. On a small rickety table positioned directly in front of him, a laptop glowed, its screen filled with the same horrifyingly complex financial models I had uncovered in his secret files. The chilling truth was immediately apparent. They weren't just holding him captive. They were forcing him to labor. They were making him work, coercing the architect to refine his own apocalyptic blueprints under duress, squeezing every last drop of terrible insight from his brilliant, tortured mind. The moment the lock surrendered and the dim interior of the unit was revealed, Daniel became a blur of decisive motion. In less than a second, he had crossed the dusty, cluttered space and was kneeling beside the chair, a tactical knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. The blade was not a threat, but a tool of liberation, its edge swiftly and expertly severing the thick nylon restraints that bit into Peter Claymore's wrists and ankles. The act was performed with a fierce, protective urgency, each cut a silent promise that the ordeal was over. The man flinched at the sudden movement, then slowly, hesitantly raised his head. His eyes, wide and bleary from exhaustion and fear, focused on Daniel's face, swimming with a disorienting mixture of raw terror and dawning, incredulous disbelief. He was a man confronting a miracle he had long since stopped praying for. His lips, dry and cracked, moved soundlessly for a moment before a hoarse, broken whisper finally emerged. They told me. They said the plane—" he stammered, the words fragmented, unable to give voice to the horrific finale he had been conditioned to accept as his own. Daniel didn't soften the truth. He delivered it with a blunt, steadying clarity that was its own form of compassion. "Crashed," he finished, his voice flat and factual, leaving no room for the haunting specter of doubt. He held the man's gaze, ensuring the next more crucial truth was equally understood. There were no survivors. The world believes you were on it. Everyone thinks you're dead. He let the chilling perfection of the scheme hang in the dusty air for a heartbeat. That was the entire point. His assessment was swift, practical, shifting from the psychological to the physical. His eyes scanned the man's frail form. "Can you walk?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for panic, only a requirement for a clear, actionable answer. This was not the time for comfort. It was the time for movement. Together we moved to either side of the actuary, gently hooking our arms under his shoulders to provide support. His legs were unsteady, weakened by confinement and shock, buckling like those of a newborn foal taking its first trembling steps into a terrifying new world. As we lifted him, taking his weight, a sudden sharp vibration buzzed against the silence, a jarring electronic intrusion. Daniel's phone, nestled in his inner coat pocket, had come to life. Without letting go of Peter, he shifted slightly, deftly retrieving the device with his free hand. A single glance at the screen froze him for a microsecond. The message was from an unknown number, a string of digits that meant nothing. There was no greeting, no context. It contained only a geographical coordinate, an address located in the industrial quarter of the city, and beneath it a single stark word that stood alone, a name that carried the weight of our most recent and personally fraught case, Sanderson. His head turned, and his eyes met mine over the slumped form of the man we had just rescued. In their grey depths was a silent, urgent question, a demand for an assessment I could not provide. The name was a key, but it had been thrown to us from the darkness, and we had no idea what lock it was meant to open. I could only meet his gaze with a blank, unsettling confusion. I had no answer. The rescue of one victim was suddenly and ominously connected to the aftermath of another. We guided a disoriented yet profoundly relieved Peter Claymore into the anxious care of his brother. Their reunion was a hushed, almost surreal event, a stark contrast to the raw, tearful explosion of the Atticus rescue. There were no cries of joy, no shouts of relief, only a stunned, trembling silence punctuated by disbelieving embraces. This was a different kind of miracle altogether. It was the quiet, impossible return of a soul plucked not from danger, but from the finality of the official record, a man restored from the cold certainty of the statistical dead. Later, ensconced once more in the worn, familiar embrace of our booth at Mel's, the adrenaline of the rescue having faded into a dull, humming exhaustion, my mind instinctively returned to its default state, seeking order. I stared into the dark surface of my coffee, as if the answers to this moral equation might be found swirling there amidst the bitter grounds. "They weaponized that crash," I said, the words feeling insufficient to capture the monstrous calculation. The scale of it was what truly sickened me. They didn't just exploit a tragedy. They used the vaporized remains of 187 souls as a smokescreen. All that grief, all that destruction, it was just background static, engineered to conceal a single precise kidnapping. It's the most horrific, the most cynical cover-up imaginable. Daniel didn't look up from his mug. His spoon made a slow, continuous circuit, stirring the black liquid with a hypnotic, rhythmic clink against the chipped ceramic. He absorbed my horrified summation and offered his own in a voice that was low, flat, and carried the weary weight of a man who had seen the darkest mechanics of the world too many times. "The world's perpetually full of noise, Michael," he stated as if commenting on the weather. "A constant, deafening cacophony of tragedy and distraction. You can't just whisper a secret and hope it gets lost in all that." He finally lifted his gaze, and his eyes were like chips of flint. The most effective way to hide one's sin, to truly bury it forever, is to stand up and commit a far louder, more spectacular one, right on top of it. You don't hide in the silence. You disappear into the explosion. The fragile, contemplative silence that had settled between us was shattered once more. This time, however, the jarring ring of the phone did not result in our usual shared, weighted glance of assessment. In a move that broke our established pattern, Daniel's own hand shot out, his fingers closing around the receiver before I could even process the sound. He brought it to his ear, his expression neutral. A soldier answering a direct line. He listened for only a brief moment, his eyes narrowing a fraction as he processed the voice on the other end. Then, without a word of explanation, he extended his arm, offering the phone to me across the table. "It's for you," he stated, his tone leaving no room for question. A profound sense of puzzlement washed over me. Calls came to the office line, but they were never for me. I was the silent partner, the background analyst. Who even knew to ask for me? My fingers closed around the still warm plastic, a knot of confusion tightening in my stomach as I slowly raised it to my ear. "Hello?" I asked, my voice tentative, bracing for some bureaucratic query about taxes or a wrong number. The voice that responded was neither bureaucratic nor confused. It was female, measured, and carried a clarity that was striking amidst the din of the diner. It was a voice emerging from calm water, not a churning sea of panic. "Michael," it said, and there was a faint, familiar resonance I couldn't immediately place. "It's Sarah Sanderson." The name landed with the force of a physical thing, and my breath caught. Before I could form a response, she continued, her tone shifting into one of direct, purposeful need. I need to speak with Daniel. Is he there?" My eyes, wide with surprise, flicked up to meet his. He was already watching me, his gaze intense and unwavering. I raised my eyebrows in a silent question. In response, he gave a single, slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent command to proceed. "He's here," I said, my voice feeling strangely thin. My heart performed a sudden, peculiar little skip in my chest, a nervous flutter that was entirely unexpected. I passed the instrument back to him, the transfer feeling significant, a baton being passed for a race I didn't understand. "Sarah," he said as he took it, his voice dropping into that lower, steadier register he used so rarely, a low rumble that seemed to promise stability. He listened intently, his face a masterful mask of neutrality, giving away nothing of what he was hearing. The only sign of his engagement was the absolute stillness of his body. "Where are you?" he asked, the question blunt and practical. A pause followed, and I could almost feel him mentally mapping her location. His next words were not a question but a directive, spoken with a quiet authority that was both protective and commanding. "Stay there." "I'm coming." The connection was severed with a soft click. He moved with a sudden, decisive energy, rising from the booth and pulling on his worn coat in one fluid motion. A $20 bill was tossed onto the Formica tabletop, a silent payment for coffees that would now go undrunk. "Everything all right?" I asked, the question feeling woefully inadequate, a feeble attempt to grasp the reins of a situation that was already galloping away from me. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame, and looked back at me. For a single, fleeting moment, the impenetrable granite of his usual demeanor cracked. In the depths of his eyes, the ghost of something long absent flickered, a spark of genuine concern, a deep instinctual protectiveness, a vulnerability I hadn't witnessed in years. It was there and gone in a heartbeat, but its impression was searing. "She remembers something," he said quietly, the words hushed but heavy with implication. "Something from the hospital, something she wasn't meant to see." And with that he was gone, the door sighing shut behind him, leaving me utterly alone in the suddenly cavernous diner. All that remained was the cooling coffee in my cup, the faint, lingering scent of his presence, and the certain chilling knowledge that the storm we had just survived, The storm we thought had passed had merely been a prelude. The true squall was only now gathering its strength, and it was heading straight for us with Sarah Sanderson at its terrifying eye.